Actually, the business. It's very diverse. A lot of big business on there. You guys did a good job. They assume because you go down the river and you see these woods, you're like, oh, it must be
He's only had 24 hours on the ground.
Although I just last night.
Good morning. I think we're about ready to start. The mics aren't on. Nope. Mics aren't on.
The camera guys can't. Don't mess with the mic. I'll take them over here.
Okay.
They're worried that they're live streaming and all that.
Okay, sorry.
Mic's on. I'm adjusting it.
I'm so sorry.
You're okay. Here, we'll turn you on right here.
Okay.
And then they're going to pick you up and broadcast you from their microphone. I'm going to adjust you for the in-house sound.
Okay. Okay. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. People will find a seat, please. Good morning, folks. Good morning. I'm Becky Sepperly, and I'm with the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, and welcome. We're delighted to see so many of you here today. it's a pleasure. You're going to enjoy. I spent the day yesterday with our speaker, and you're going to really enjoy listening to him, and he'll, I know, want to listen to you as well. So, excuse me. The order of the day, we'll have breakfast, spend about 15 minutes, then eating breakfast, and then we'll have the program will begin. But before we begin, I thought it might be appropriate, not inappropriate, but appropriate, to have a moment of silence for those here in the United States, in Baltimore in particular, and those around the world in Nepal who are struggling and not as fortunate as we are today to be able to sit down to a beautiful place and have a nice lunch or a nice breakfast and begin to talk about how we can recreate our city. So if you would, let's just take a moment of silence. Thank you. And now we'll begin with breakfast and give you about 15 minutes to eat a little bit and begin the program. Well,
You look like you were looking to set it down.
Just roaming around.
persistence, that can-do spirit, overcoming odds, making the impossible possible, and never giving up. It is ever so critical for our communities to make them better, to become stronger, to become the West Virginia that we want to be on the local, regional, and state level. While we experience many challenges in West Virginia, we also seem to have, and we should accept, great honor of amazing accomplishments. Many of you in this room are doing great work, and we're so thrilled to have individuals not here just from Charleston, but from the northern Panhandle to the southern coalfields, from the Potomac River to the Middle Ohio Valley. We thought when we hosted Rip here from Kresge, we might have a small group of maybe 30 or 50. We're so pleased to have nearly 90 here. But also, we're going from West Virginia to the world today, thanks to our friends at West Virginia Public Broadcasting. We're broadcasting live stream, and our thanks to Scott Finn and Chuck Roberts and their team to be able to share this with our friends across the regional association communities, across all 50 states, our friends at the Kresge Foundation, as well as the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation. When you think about philanthropy, we talk about convening sectors, partnering, taking risks, innovating, being the sector that is allowed to really create solutions, to provide leadership, and looking at the philanthropy's role in ethical leadership. And what we are also smart to know is philanthropy. We're not the only one in the game. Our success has resulted in working with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. But we also must realize that we work across political ideologies, we work across communities. And Charleston's success is Wheeling's success, just as it is Tomahawk's success in Barbersville. And when we work across all those sectors, as ethical leaders across all the areas, we see amazing results. Now you might laugh when I've talked about philanthropy, I didn't mention the money. But no, I didn't. Because the money isn't always the thing with philanthropy. It's that convening power, that potential, and building collaborations. And so in the honor of our good friend and guest here today, Rip Rapson from Michigan, I use the words of Henry Ford. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Let me say that again. Coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. Henry Ford was thinking of many things as a business leader, as a philanthropist. Again, reassuring the importance of the long game as philanthropy. We focus not just on a term of election of 2 or 4 or 6 years. Our dedication is the next 25, 50, and 100 years. And so we're so pleased to have you here to hear from Rip. My name is Paul Daugherty, and I serve as CEO of Philanthropy West Virginia, the State Leadership Association for private, family, corporate, and community grant-making foundations. Our mission is strengthening philanthropy in the Mountain State. And we know that to make that possible here in West Virginia and across Central Appalachia, we must work together. We would not be here today without our good friends in partnering with the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, but also the Mayor Foundation. I know Holmes Morrison is here, and let's give a round of applause for the Mayor Foundation to host this program. And for those that are of the social media genre, for those via live broadcast, you can follow us at Philanthropy WV and at TGKVF1. Our hashtags are We Are the Answer. Hashtag also is put West Virginia or WV first. As one wise soul recently said in a public policy committee meeting, we sometimes sit around waiting for somebody to come and bring the solutions to our communities and to our causes. We are who we are waiting for. We are the answer. And Detroit and Michigan is a great example of that and the efforts that have taken place. And so Rip, bringing his great skill and expertise since taking over the leadership of the Kresge Foundation in 2006, will share those efforts and those great works. A little bit about Rip, and I have to say, I have had the opportunity to spend the past 24 hours with him, probably more time than he wants to spend with Paul Daugherty than most people would. Thoughtful, hardworking, creative, out of the box, but product-oriented, results-oriented, opportunity. When we sat down yesterday with West Virginia Metro News, they asked, so what can West Virginia learn from Michigan? And the first thing he said is, I don't pretend to know the issues of West Virginia, nor tell West Virginia what to do. And that's a great thing to hear from somebody on the national level, to say, I want to hear from what West Virginia has going on. But he thoughtfully and respectfully shared to us and said, During the best times and the hardest times, we come together as community. It's in our DNA to make things possible. And also he references that when he looks at the resilience of West Virginia, it is just stunning. And also he's impressed as what we're doing. And I guarantee he'll impress all of us with his presentation. With no further ado, Rip Rapson.
Good morning, everybody. Oh my, with that kind of introduction, I have nowhere to go. I have been really struck in the very short time I've been in West Virginia by exactly what Paul described, which is the strength of a community that has this glorious tradition of building things in so many different ways, building community, building economies, building sort of long-term legacy work that from generation to generation has distinguished West Virginia in the most remarkable ways. But, you know, in many ways, it is really tempting to come from a place like Michigan, which has gone through so much turmoil and so much dislocation over the last 30 or 40 years, and say, here are 4 or 5 things that I think that we've learned from Michigan that you absolutely have to do. And the more I heard from folks at lunch yesterday and at dinner last night, the more I was convinced that that's absolutely the wrong approach. That the kinds of ground wire that you have into your community, into your traditions, into your culture, into your leadership models, is unique. And there is a sort of a toughness and a resilience about West Virginians that is really quite remarkable. And so what I'd like to try to do this morning is, again, less sort of suggest clear-cut ways of coming at economic development that will guide you into a new and different future. I just think that only you and the communities you serve can ultimately figure out that path. But what I would like to do, because I come out of philanthropy and because I come out of this very interesting place called Detroit, is talk a little bit about what happens when those two worlds come together, and how has philanthropy thought about taking a place like Detroit, which in many ways, for many people, was on its back and a complete basket case 10 years ago and just ready to be sort of shut down. Are there some lessons that we have drawn within our own community that may or may not resonate with all of you? I've joked with a couple of you at tables that folks around the room attended dinner last night. How many people were at dinner last night? Oh, well, so much for those stories. Okay. I think as a result, I'm going to take a slightly different tack from what I did last night. Last night, I talked about 4 or 5 different ways that philanthropy has sort of worked in Detroit to sort of advance a civic agenda. And I'm going to do a little bit of that, but I'm going to twist it slightly and try to figure out whether there are 4 or 5 ways in which philanthropy can actually have some kind of material impact on the trajectory of an economy, particularly of an economy that's going through rapid change and is having to recalibrate, in some cases, some of its most fundamental principles. So let me, I don't think I have to set the table too extensively for you for Detroit, other than to say, and forgive me, folks from last night, that in 2009, the sort of the slow and difficult decline that Detroit had experienced ever since the civil disturbances, the riots of the 60s, really came to a head. And it came to a head for 3 or 4 reasons. One was the Great Recession that we all suffered through and just threw us all into a different way of thinking about the future economy. Second was the foreclosure crisis. Detroit was particularly vulnerable to the kinds of predatory lending that just became the sort of the bane of that crisis, and we saw thousands upon thousands of homes foreclosed upon, which just exacerbated a general decline in our housing stock. Third, I hope, unlike West Virginia, we had a complete political meltdown in Detroit. We had someone who was called the hip-hop mayor, elected at age 31, Kwame Kilpatrick. I had the great pleasure of spending many, 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 many hours with Kwame Kilpatrick before we realized he was a criminal. And it was a surreal experience to come to Detroit and be part of an administration that was young and hip and energetic and policy-oriented, only to find that underneath all of that was this corrosive set of practices that ultimately led him to be indicted and put in jail. So we had not only a recession, not only the foreclosure crisis, and we had a complete political collapse. And then, by the way, the auto industry was on its back. I think we tend to forget in Detroit that in 2008, 2009, it was, I think, most people's best bet that Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors would all be out of business within a matter of years. And we can, and I'm happy to, talk a little bit about whether the auto bailout made sense. But the point was that it caused Detroit to fundamentally reassess its place in the world, because when you have the kind of powerhouse industry that the automobile industry is in Detroit, and I suspect you can imagine, given sort of the dominance of a number of industries in West Virginia, when that economy just falls out, it's very hard to sort of see around the corner and imagine a future. So I say all of that because what I talked about last night was the methodical attempts that philanthropy made to try to get together as a community, read off the same page, and sort of hold the line until we could get our bearings back again. I think everybody understood that the public sector couldn't walk off the stage forever. We have to have a responsible, competent public sector in order to do our work, not just in Detroit, but anywhere. And it was certainly our expectation that one way or another we would see the revival of the economic base that was represented by the autos. But we didn't know when. We didn't know if it was going to be a year. We didn't know it was going to be 5 years. We didn't know it was going to be 20 years. And so philanthropy went about the business of trying to stitch together a set of gestures that would create scaffolding for the community, whether it was in transit or in land use reform or in housing policy or in arts and culture policy, things that would sort of give us a sense that we had stabilized enough so that we could keep people invested in the future of their town. So one of the consequences of that was a coalescing of the foundation community in a way that Detroit had never seen. I think when I arrived in Detroit in 2006, the foundation community didn't talk to one another. We all occupied the same space, but someone did human services, someone did Main Street program, someone did something else. We didn't meet, we didn't talk, we didn't confer, and I think it's safe to say that 6 or 7 or 8 years later, there is a tightness of that community that actually reminds me a great deal of this community. And I think in many ways you are far ahead, certainly are far ahead of where we were 5 or 6 years ago, and are probably every bit as far along as the community in Detroit is now. So a long, long prelude for my wanting to suggest to you 5 or 6 ways that I think philanthropy, as it comes together, can have impact on the economic trajectory of a place. And I'll be interested to see whether you feel any of this resonates at all to Charleston and to West Virginia generally. So having said all that, let me start with where I began last night, which is the role of philanthropy in sort of being a table center. Last night I gave you one example. It was very long. Most of you, I think, glazed over as I talked about it. So I'm going to try something a little bit different and talk about something that actually happened in Minneapolis when I was there a decade ago. About a decade ago, the president of the University of Minnesota, a guy named Mark Yudof, gave a speech to the collected officials of the state of Minnesota that sort of knocked their feet out from under them. He basically spoke for an hour at this huge statewide convening about how the Minneapolis-St. Paul community was absolutely losing its edge. That this community that had produced General Mills and Medtronic and Best Buy and the Pillsbury Company and all of these extraordinary institutions had just lost its competitive zeal. And I was in the audience, and it was really remarkable. I mean, people were hissing and booing. This is the president of the University of Minnesota, our largest, Minnesota's largest educational institution. And Udolph began sort of walking through the ways in which the impulses of collaboration of the private sector, working with the university sector, working with the public sector, had just sort of disappeared. And everyone was sort of going into their own corners, doing their own thing. And although that might be good for Pillsbury or it might be good for Medtronic, it wasn't good for the community. And it just started a firestorm. Rarely has sort of one speech generated that kinds of activity. And so Udolph called me and said, yikes, what am I doing? He's from Texas. He had no clue about what he had just begun. And I said, Mark, you've got to finish what you began. You've really got to figure out some way to capture this energy. And I said, I would suggest that you appoint 19 of the smartest people from different sectors of your community, pull together a commission and figure out what are the 10 or 11 things. And they have to be very practical. They can't be abstract. They can't be what the Chamber of Commerce would do or what the business partnership would do. They have to be very particular to the different sectors. So Udolph did it. They spent about 6 months, and they came up with mush. It was just mush. And so it started all over again. People said, well, you can't even deliver on your promise. So at that point, does anyone remember Control Data Corporation? Control Data Corporation was the first supercomputer firm to create sort of a worldwide presence in the supercomputer business. And the head of Control Data was a guy named Larry Perlman. And Larry had been the chair of this commission that Udolph had set up. And he came into my office and he said, Rip, this just can't do. I mean, we've had this speech that got everybody all worked up. We had this commission that produced nothing, and people are even angrier than they were before. What are we going to do? And I said, and why are you talking to me? At that point, I was running the McKnight Foundation, which is sort of the Kresge of Minneapolis. And he said, what you can do is be the neutral convener of a conversation that is well-informed, that doesn't have a dog in the hunt. Part of the problem with Udolph's commission is it ended up tilting really strongly to the university, and so many of its recommendations were all about what the university could do, the resources the university needed, and it was just marginalized by the business community that just said, really, what? That's not the issue. And he said, and so would you be willing to lead a process that really tried to get at these issues? I didn't even begin to know how to do that. So the best I could do was to call 7 or 8 friends from the business community, leaders from the business community, and said, would you sit with me over a breakfast or two, and we'll try to scope out what a process like this would look like. To make a very long story short, what we ended up doing was creating something called the Itasca Project. Itasca is a little park in northern Minnesota, where the headwaters of the Mississippi lie. And for years and years in the 1960s, the corporate community in Minneapolis and St. Paul would take a week, go up to Itasca, and sort of plot out the future of their community. So in the 1960s, this led to the creation of the Guthrie Theater, the attraction of the Washington Senators to Minnesota to become the Minnesota Twins. All of these extraordinary things by 18 white men sort of sitting in a little retreat center in northern Minnesota figuring out the world. And so I thought, well, it'd be sort of a nice irony to call this the Itasca Project, but to blow it out in a much more expansive way. And what we ended up doing was asking McKinsey and Company to survey all 100 of the largest businesses in the Twin Cities region and just ask very simple questions. What are the issues? What are the resources we have to combat those issues? What are the 3 or 4 priority things that we need to do in order to make forward progress. Very simple. But the nice thing about McKinsey is they had access directly to the CEOs, didn't have to work through, with all due respect, development officers and other folks, but went right to the top. And at the end of about 6 months, they produced our report. And so I and Larry Perlman, the guy from CD, Control Data, and I issued an invitation to the governor, the mayors of Minneapolis and St. Paul, and the CEOs only, not their vice presidents, not their directors of corporate affairs, to come to a meeting of the Itasca project where we would review the findings of McKinsey and figure out what to do. And we have Minnesota has two very strong business organizations. One is the statewide chamber, and one is something called the Minnesota Business Partnership, which is also a coalition of the 100 largest businesses in the state of Minnesota, and they were invited as well. And when they came, and McKinsey sort of laid out the agenda, you could actually hear a sort of a gasp in the room, because what McKinsey had found from these interviews with CEOs was not the business partnerships agenda, which had largely been to lower taxation rates and to ease regulatory burdens. And it wasn't the chamber's agenda, which was largely to sort of build the small business space. It was to reform transportation in the region. It was to promote early childhood development in the region. It was to reduce health disparities, and then there were a couple of other things. And I'll never forget, Governor Pawlenty stood up and he said, this is not right. This is not what the business community wants. And then the head of the Minnesota Business Partnership, Charlie Weaver, stood up, said the same thing. And I'll never forget Marilyn Carlson Nelson, who runs the Carlson companies, the Radisson, everything. One of the few women in the room sort of leaned in and said, "Governor, they got it exactly right, and this is what we propose to do." And from that point on, the governor sat down and didn't say much else. Charlie Weaver left the room, and we ended up putting together task forces, working groups around the 4 priorities: transportation, childhood, health disparities, and there's actually a patent transfer issue because people felt that we needed to work much more closely between the university system and the private sector. It was very practical. And each of these committees was headed by 2 of the CEOs. And so Jim McNerney, some of you may know, now runs Boeing, was at that point the head of 3M. Dick Schultz, the head of Best Buy, headed one. I mean, these were very high-powered folks. But what happened was a couple of things. One is that they were staffed by McKinsey, essentially. That McKinsey donated its time to sort of prepare materials so that these guys who are used to the highest quality board materials and preparatory materials for their meetings saw those when they walked into the room. And then the really sort of subversive thing is that the actual substantive staffing of transportation, of childhood, of healthcare was done by the nonprofit community. And at first, the corporate liaisons, the heads of community affairs, just went berserk. They said, this is just an elaborate attempt by the McKnight Foundation and the nonprofit sector to preempt the business agenda. But what ended up happening, of course, is over time, the private sector realized that the nonprofit sector had an enormous amount of expertise in transportation, in healthcare, in early childhood development, intellectual property development. And we developed these extraordinary working groups. I go to all of that length to suggest a couple of things I think that came directly out of Paul's opening remarks. Is one, there was this remarkable resistance in a very enlightened place to have these sectors sit at the same table. And 12 years later, the Itasca project is still meeting every quarter. And they are scrolling through issues one by one by one, and have had success on almost every one. I'm going to tell you just one quick example in a moment. And so the breakdown of the sort of the preconceptions about what different sectors had to offer, how they could work together, was just remarkable. Second, it became a remarkable learning tool for the public sector. The public sector that really thought it had figured out community priorities realized that it had a lot to learn from the business community, from the nonprofit community, from the philanthropic community. and from the university community. And it began, I think, a period of much more intensive joint policy development that sort of got over the usual sort of ideological rigidity that can so often characterize our policy work. And let me just give you an example, and then I'll move on. The very first topic the Itasca project chose to take on was regional transportation. Twin Cities had never had a regional transportation system. It just, it's a car culture, and end of story. And the Itasca project organized a couple of inner-city visits. We went to Denver, we went to Seattle, and we realized that communities actually can design from the ground up transportation systems. You don't have to be the New York City subway system or the Boston system. You can actually very carefully use all of the processes of civic planning to put together a system that serves your entire region. But we had probably 10, 15, 20 plans over 10 or 20 years in Minneapolis to try to figure out how to do transit. None of them went anywhere. So I finally asked the head of what we call the Metropolitan Council, which is a regional governance body in Minneapolis and St. Paul. I said, just go lock your door, take a month, take all of those plans, take the best elements of every one of them, and just come and present to the Itasca project. And so he did. And despite its complexity and despite its potential price tag, the Itasca leadership basically said, we've got to do this. I mean, the head of Best Buy said, I can't get goods across the region effectively. And people like Jim McNerney at 3M said, I hear all the time that our folks are stuck in traffic and they can't get their kids dropped off at daycare and get into work in a timely way. We've just got to break this cycle. So slowly, the sort of consensus built in Itasca for a very significant transportation bill and reform. We used this broad framework to develop a suite of legislative packages, and then something really interesting happened. The CEOs, and again, there were about 40 of them, began having dinners with the legislators. And when you get a call from the head of 3M, or you get a call from the head of General Mills or Medtronic, you come. And so these legislators started coming to these dinners, and they were very small dinners, and they were in the homes of the CEOs. And it was very personalized and very interesting. And one by one, they hit every single legislator. It was almost not playing fair. They hit every single legislator in a Republican-controlled legislature where this was perceived to be sort of a Democratic issue. And so that was impressive. And when the framework was then introduced into legislation, it actually passed the House and the Senate. And Governor Pawlenty, who was still probably smarting from that very first meeting of Itasca, vetoed the bill. And we thought, well, that's that. You've got Republican Senate, Republican House. No way they're going to override a Republican governor's veto. They did. They overrode the veto. And it was because of the Itasca project. There is just no two ways about it. There is no way the nonprofit sector could have delivered this. There is no way that the foundation sector could have delivered this. It was a direct result of the Itasca project. And that has been their methodology ever since. They've taken on more complex issues like early childhood development and health disparities, but they have sort of taken the same approach of trying to build this broad consensus, working both the public, private, and nonprofit angles and getting things done. I have no idea what that has to do with West Virginia, but I thought it was an interesting model. And I actually do think that we can talk about whether it does. So again, McKnight's role, the foundation's role, was simply setting the table. It was asking McKinsey to donate time. It was lining up the nonprofits to help staff the work. And we convened the meetings quarterly. And so I would stand up for about 3 seconds, welcome people, and then get out of the way so that the head of Wells Fargo could chair the meetings. But it was a powerful role because I think people didn't think, and I think they were correct, that we had an agenda. We simply wanted the problems solved. And I think the the business CEOs really appreciated that. And I think it was an important example of how philanthropy, in its neutrality and in its expanse of reach across different kinds of resources, can be a real table setter. So the second, I forgot about my PowerPoint. I should just ignore my PowerPoint, probably. They're just funny little drawings.
I'm here if you want me to.
Well, why don't you do the first one? Let's see what it was. Oh yeah, these were going to be the 6 different roles, and I won't take as long for each of the 6, I promise. So up in the left-hand corners is sort of helping set the long-term vision and broadening the civic lines. What's next? Oh, we just did that. Okay. So the second is helping build civic capacity. And this doesn't really sound like an economic development strategy, but when you think about how fragile civic capacity is in times of economic downturn and distress, you realize that sometimes people are just so focused on putting one foot in front of the other that they can't even see out very far to imagine a different set of possibilities. And nowhere is that more true than in this Detroit period that I talked about in 2009. There was just no incentive to try risks, to try to step out, because everyone was just reeling. I mean, foreclosures and economic contraction and auto failure and political dysfunction. I mean, where is the incentive in that to take risks, try new things, break the mold of things that simply weren't working? And I think Einstein once said, it's just complete folly to think that you can continue to solve problems by using the same methods that created the problems in the first place. And that's where Detroit was. It was just in a complete sort of downward cycle. And so one of the ways that we thought we might try to help is to inject a different sense of energy into some of the key civic organizations that might help guide Detroit's future recovery. And just a couple of examples. I talked about one last night, in that one of the huge intractable issues that Detroit faces is the extraordinary swaths of abandonment and blight that I'm sure you've all seen in pictures of Detroit, with just acres upon acres of trees growing up in the middle of houses and houses falling down. It's true. I mean, as I mentioned last night, we have 90,000 blighted and abandoned properties in Detroit. If you were to aggregate all of those into a landmass, it would be 40 square miles, or the size of the city of San Francisco. It's stunning how difficult this is. And it was clear that the city of Detroit in 2008, 2009, after the Kwame Kilpatrick's demise, had no capacity to deal with this issue. And yet, everything it did was constrained by the reality of having too much land to manage. It had been once a town of 2 million. It's now a town of 700,000, and spreading services across that landmass that was intended to support 2 million just became ridiculously inefficient. I mean, and you've probably heard these horror stories about police response times for priority 1 calls being 58 minutes. 40% of all of the streetlights in Detroit not working. Well, I don't mean to make excuses, but one of the reasons is it was spread too thin. You could not budget across such a huge mass, to say nothing about managing your money poorly. That's a whole other conversation. So essentially what we did, and I won't retell this story, I'm sorry, for last night, for the folks who are here from last night, is essentially we offered to bring in the resources of sort of technical planning and community engagement to begin a process that would allow the city to sort of get a handle on its land. And to make a very long story short, we brought in a suite of planners from all across the world to think about water use or infrastructure redevelopment or housing policy. And we also then contracted with a series of organizations to do community-based conversations about how neighborhood residents themselves wanted to think about the use of land. And over 4 or 5 very difficult years, we were able to develop a land use plan for the city of Detroit that today now has really helped directionally give people a sense that we can sort of double down on places that are strong and deserve greater investment, and the weak side can convert unproductive land to more productive uses, whether that's through urban farming or reforestation or parkland or whatever it might be. It's actually quite an extraordinary thing. But it required philanthropy to step up and underwrite the costs, the time, and the process that the city government simply could not bear. It wasn't a substitute for city functions. At the end of the day, what we created was a framework that ultimately has to be held by the city and executed on by the city. And how effectively that's been done, we can talk about. But the point is that we actually wanted to hand this off to the city, and that's what happened. A second quick example that I think is actually a fascinating example is that when we went down to New Orleans to talk with the New Orleans folks about what the 2 or 3 things they did to most effectively reposition themselves after Katrina, we heard a little bit about community engagement. We heard a little bit about Brad Pitt. We couldn't get Brad Pitt to come to Detroit, but for those of you who don't know, Pitt developed a housing corporation down there that did a lot of very sort of habitat-like housing construction. It was very effective, and he deserves a lot of credit for that. We couldn't get him to come. But the third thing they said is the most important thing they did was something called the New Orleans Revitalization Fellows. And we took that and applied it to Detroit, because what it was New Orleans identified about 50 mid-career slots in planning, design, economic development, where they could actually place people in key city agencies who had sort of mid-career expertise, who weren't necessarily from the community, and who could help sort of jumpstart the community development process. So we essentially stole that, brought it up to Detroit, and created something called the Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows. We opened up for 30 slots a national call for people to be interested. We didn't know if anyone would come, with the idea that 10 would be from Detroit, 10 would be people who had lived in Detroit at one point but had moved away, and then 10 would be folks who had never been to Detroit. We got 700 applications for those 30 positions from all over the world. And we chose the first cohort of 30, and basically the agreement was that we would pay 2 years of salary, and we would place them in key hospital positions, key community development positions, in City Hall, in our economic development agency. And we are now in our third tranche of those. So we have now almost 100 revitalization fellows in the cohort, only 30 at a time. And what we have found is that it has been remarkable for the extent to which it has infused new energy, new ideas, new networks, and as folks in this room know, these kids go viral immediately. So they're on texts and on email telling all of their friends about Detroit and how they should come. And so this, you can't change a city with 30 people or 60 people or 90 people. But, oh my gosh, the networks they developed has just been a complete game changer. And they also developed sort of an internal cohort. So these 90 people, and of the 90, 87 have chosen to stay in Detroit. I think we've lost 3 or 4, but the vast majority of them have chosen to stay in Detroit. And so they're buying houses, they're raising families, they're starting small businesses, they're working in agencies, and the level of energy and optimism and sort of cracking the code mentality has been just remarkable. Again, philanthropy has sort of the luxury to be able to sort of step back, provide a little bit of catalytic money, and let things take hold. We can't build the capacity of the city, but we can do small gestures like this that end up sort of radiating out in ways that we couldn't even begin to expect. So that's a second way, it seems to me, that philanthropy can help promote economic development. The third, oh, it's working now. Yeah, the third is the idea of peeling away risk. I spoke last night about the idea that philanthropy can really be society's social venture capital. It's risk capital. It can do things that the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector simply can't do. And let me just give you a couple of simple examples of transactions where philanthropy just sort of peeled away the first layer of risk, where the private markets simply weren't willing to go. I mean, if you're let me just start with an example. If you're a grocery store chain, are you going to move into the heart of Detroit with all of its demographics of average household income, literacy rates, whatever you're looking at to make your location determination? The answer is almost certainly not. The market is not ready for you. And so one of the things that philanthropy can do is to say, would you go if your financial risk were mitigated? And most businesses would say, well, how much, right? And that's a reasonable question. And one of the classic ways in which this played out in Detroit was access to fresh food. It is just criminal how far people in Detroit have to drive in order to get fresh food. They can go to a 7-Eleven, they can go to a corner convenience store, but to get vegetables, fruit, particularly vegetables or fruit of any quality, they've got to go into the suburbs, at least until very recently. And so I got a call from the head of Whole Foods a number of years ago saying, a really enlightened guy, and he said, you know, Rip, we really would love to locate in inner city Detroit, but we just can't make the numbers work. We can't do it. And I said, well, are you sure you're looking at the right metrics? And he said, please don't tell me my business. We can't make the numbers work. And I said, so what are you asking? He said, if you could take off our top line risk, we believe that we can actually make a go of it after about 2 years. But we just can't get through the first 2 years, and I can't take it to my co-investors unless we can get through those first 2 years. And this is a little bit like the story I told last night. And I should stop asking this question. I said, so how much would that cost? And Walter Rube said, well, it'd probably be almost $900,000. That would be our shortfall in these first 2 years. Well, we had already set up at our Economic Development Corporation a small fund to try to provide incentives to grocery stores to locate in the city. But we were having this problem over and over again. It wasn't just High Foods because it was high end. Any national grocery store chain was having the same problem. And I said, well, maybe rather than sort of feeding this fund that doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, we should go ahead and take a flyer on Whole Foods. So we did. We actually gave, not Whole Foods, we gave our Economic Development Corporation $900,000. They then moved it over to Whole Foods, and Whole Foods went to work building out a store right in the middle of downtown. I went the second day it was opened. I couldn't get in the front door. And one of the things that was so interesting was people were saying, well, Whole Foods, it's sort of a yuppie, elitist thing. What the heck are you doing putting a Whole Foods in the middle of, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the upper Midwest? And when I walked in the door that second day, 95% of the people in that store were African American. And Whole Foods, over the next number of months, broke every record on its books for gross level of sales, as well as some of its nets. And within, I think Walter told me, within 6 months, they had made up all of the deficit they had expected over a 2-year program. Now, shame on me, I should have made this a loan, right? He should have paid us back. But it was worth the loss. And today, Whole Foods is talking about opening a second store in Detroit. And on the heels of Whole Foods, we have seen 4 or 5 different grocery chains come in because Whole Foods broke the mold. Again, simple construct, but really important is if philanthropy can peel back that first layer of risk in markets where the risk is too high, you actually can get something done. Let me suggest too that you can do that not just sort of transaction by transaction, but you can do it for an ecology. And there, the example I want to give you is in entrepreneurship. If there was any community that was sort of the antithesis of entrepreneurship it was Detroit. It was a command and control economy. I mean, you had the big autos and the auto supply, the tier ones and the tier twos, I mean, basically calling the shots. And it's not to say that small businesses weren't innovative. It's just they had to innovate to the specifications of the mothership. And so there has never been in Detroit, really almost back to Henry Ford, this sort of sense of entrepreneurship, small, feisty businesses starting things up and getting things going. It's just not the way a command and control economy works. And so in the depths of 2008 and 2009, when it was not at all clear that the auto economy was going to come back, we had to say, what is our economy? I mean, the absence of an auto economy was almost unimaginable in a place like Detroit, but you had to ask the question. And basically the answer came back, diversification, 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 that bringing in another mega industry didn't work. Maybe you could get a factory that would employ 3,000 people, but across the kind of demographic sweep of a place like Detroit, you really had to think about how do you over time grow small businesses. And the head of the Ford Foundation, a woman named Susan Beresford, had the idea that if we could put together a fund that would not be sort of an angel investor fund, not be a venture fund, but that would help create the infrastructure that would support entrepreneurship, we could sort of de-risk the proposition again. And so she said, I'll put up $25 million from the Ford Foundation if I'm not the lowest bidder. And so she got the Kellogg Foundation and the Kresge Foundation each to put in 25. We then worked with our smaller foundation partners in Detroit, and we got the fund up ultimately to almost $130 million. And that $130 million fund has paid for space for small entrepreneurs. It has paid for training. It has paid for back office support. It's paid for some very minor sort of startup help for small businesses. And the proliferation of small businesses in Detroit, you would not believe. For folks who haven't been there in the last 6 or 7 years, it's a different world. You have hair shops, lifestyle stores, little tech firms. I mean, everywhere it's just popping up. And then there's a whole nother story that I could tell if people are interested later about Dan Gilbert, the head of Quicken Loans, who moved his entire company downtown because he saw this sort of burgeoning small business entrepreneurship environment growing up, and he has now moved almost 14,000 employees down into downtown Detroit. And he thinks of himself, he thinks of Quicken not as a mortgage company, but as a tech company, because so much of what they do is in the sort of the realm of tech. I mention this again because it seems to me it's a way of trying to create a system that was high risk, because if you go firm by firm by firm, that's about as high risk as you get. And instead trying to take some of the risk out of the system, and it seems to me only philanthropy could have done that. It just wasn't happening in Detroit. I'll move more quickly because I know people want to ask questions. So let me quickly turn to the fourth piece, which is, this is not one that I think is intuitive. And that is, I think in Detroit, probably the most important thing philanthropy has done is to serve as a guarantor of value to the private markets. And let me tell you what I mean by that. It's quite simple. It's simply creating an environment with the kind of amenity structures and support structures that ultimately businesses need in order to succeed. The best example, two quick examples. One is, before I came, I wish I could take credit for this. I desperately wish I could take credit for this, but I can't. My predecessor chose to invest $50 million of Kresge's money in the reclamation of the riverfront. Detroit has a wonderful, wonderful riverfront. It looks across the river, the Detroit River, to Windsor, Canada. It's the largest international crossing in the United States. But the riverfront was just classic urban America riverfront. Grain silos, dumping grounds, abandoned warehouses. It was a mess. And John Marshall, my predecessor, had the enormous vision to suggest that if we could use, Kresge used to do capital challenge grants. We would provide grants to organizations to sort of build out capital campaigns. And he used the same sort of model to say, if we put the first money on the table, could we essentially challenge the community to come to the table and build out the rest of the project? So we put $50 million on the table, designed something called the Riverfront Conservancy, and sure enough, General Motors came to the table, all of the corporate community came to the table, and we raised almost $300 million over the course of 4 or 5 years. And the riverfront in Detroit this morning is glorious. It is a beautiful riverfront. It was master planned by an international team. It's got walkways and bicycle ways, and a little bit like Whole Foods, it was criticized early on as being the sort of elitist upper class thing. You walk the riverfront today, and it reflects the population of our community. It is people of all ages, all races, and it is truly an extraordinary anchor to the community. Together with, and I won't repeat this story, the creation of a light rail system, which the very, very short version is, Kresge, again, put in $50 million. We began with a $35 million commitment that just kept getting more and more expensive, but we essentially ended up planning, capitalizing a light rail system that was privately built, but that will be publicly owned and publicly managed. We essentially, with Roger Penske of Penske companies, led an effort to try to make sure that we could run up and down the spinal cord of the city of Detroit a rail system that would ultimately lead to connections to the job growth areas to the north and to Ann Arbor and Chicago to the west, essentially the beginning of a regional rail system. And it is coming to fruition. Again, long story short, but the point here is that when Dan Gilbert decided to move his 3,000 employees from Livonia, Michigan, into downtown Detroit, and he decided increasingly to consolidate his operations and to get all of his suppliers to co-locate. He now owns 65 buildings in downtown Detroit. It's just extraordinary. When someone asked him why he did that, he said, "I wouldn't have done it if it weren't for the arts and cultural activity in downtown and if it weren't for the riverfront and the rail system." He said, "I cannot convince young people to come into a city where there is not public transit. I cannot convince them to come into a city where they can't walk along a riverfront or enjoy an amenity structure that makes sense." Again, we didn't cause Dan Gilbert to relocate to downtown Detroit, but I think we created the preconditions for his decision in both the riverfront, the rail system, and there are 3 or 4 others. It's a really important, but I think often misunderstood element of philanthropy. We can actually create the kind of undergirdings, the preconditions that the private sector looks to when it's thinking about its long-term return. Fifth, and then maybe I'll stop at number 5. I've got 6, but I'll stop at number 5. Fifth is, I think philanthropy can be a powerful seller. And let me tell you what I mean by that, is that when you have a philanthropy like Kresge, it has sort of a foot in Detroit and sort of a foot in national work. About 80% of our work is national, only about 20% of our work is local. But when you have that deep connection to a place, it's a little bit like Heinz in Pittsburgh or Lilly in Indianapolis, you have the opportunity to sort of sell to unexpected audiences. And my favorite story here is that when Detroit's bankruptcy was declared in 2013, I got a call from Gene Sperling. Sperling was the president's economic advisor, head of the Council on Economic Advisors. And Gene said, "Rip, we can't do what Detroit wants us to do. We can't issue bonds to get you out of your bankruptcy. We can't forgive your debt. We can't even pass legislation to help you. But what I think we can do is find ways to ease some of the regulatory requirements you're working under, to figure out ways that maybe underutilized federal programs could be better used in Detroit, maybe even take unspent monies from certain programs and transfer them over. But we need your help to understand where that would make a difference." And so I collected Roger Penske and Dan Gilbert and some of our other corporate leaders. We went out to Washington and met with well, I thought we were going to go meet with Gene. We ended up meeting with 8 of the cabinet secretaries, Sperling, the head of the White House tech office. I mean, it was just this unbelievable meeting. We sat for 3 hours and we sort of scrolled through what we believed the possibilities of federal help would be. We had actually prepared a sort of a working document for them that sort of said in housing it might look like this, in transit it might look like this, in public safety it might look like this. Great meeting, we leave. Sperling then puts together working teams from different agencies on each one of these topics, and within 3 months sends us this white paper that basically says in 5 areas, housing, transportation, public safety, technological capacity, and 1 or 2 others, here's what we think we can do. And then we took it at Kresge, got our foundation colleagues in the room together with some of the folks from the mayor's office and tried to sort of scope out the reasonableness of what they had suggested. Sent it back to them. They had asked us to do some matching of time and money. And at the end of the day, what they produced probably 3 months after that initial meeting was a package of supports that ended up totaling almost $300 million without a cent of new federal money. And it was taking unspent CDBG monies. It was permitting CDBG monies that had never been allowed to be used for commercial demolition, It was finding in the Department of Transportation's budget little pockets of money for bus repair that Detroit couldn't. I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but it was truly extraordinary. And I think it would not have happened if they didn't have a Sherpa. They needed someone on the ground to say, this is the ground truth, this is where this money could be well spent, this is where we have the capacity to use it. And there were 3 or 4 areas where we simply could not have used their money. It wouldn't work. It would have just been a wasted effort, and no one was interested in that. So my sense is that philanthropy, by acting sort of as a seller, it's by trying to create a case for investment and then framing up the case in the particulars, can be an enormously important supporter of the kind of economic development that this ended up providing. And it was enormously helpful. It was completely under the radar. One of the interesting things, I don't mean to be political about it, but one of the interesting things was that there was absolutely no political advantage for the Obama administration to do this. Zip. I mean, why would you try to get money under the radar to the city of Detroit? It was done for all of the right reasons. And I think it was, at least in part, because they trusted the integrity of the Detroit environment to sort of deliver real answers in real time to real issues. There are other roles, but let me stop there. It seems to me that what Paul set us up with is maybe where I would close, which is philanthropy can do many of these things that I've just described, but ultimately it can't do it without the help of the entire civic community. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but in every single one of these examples, we had to work hand in glove with the private sector, with the public sector, whether it's the local, state, or federal public sectors, with the nonprofit sectors. And that's hard. I remember when I first came to McKnight, I proposed some kind of collaboration, and my deputy said, "Oh, stop, Rip, you've got enough money. You know, McKnight has all this money. Don't bother with collaboration." And I think it was the worst advice anyone has ever given me. Because ultimately, collaboration not only leverages in additional dollars and additional expertise, it also builds community will. And I think that's why that Itasca project example is such a powerful example. It wasn't ultimately about how much money we were going to spend on transit. It was the fact that the different sectors of the community could find common ground on an issue of burning importance to the community and make systematic progress toward its realization. And as I look at what you all are doing here, what Becky is doing, what Paul is doing, what so many of you in the room are doing, I think this is exactly what you're doing. You're beginning to sort of stitch together the kinds of disparate points of view, the disparate expertise, not so much the money. Maybe the money is helpful, it's important, it's critical, but ultimately it's aligning around a sense of shared community direction and shared community vision. And there is no substitute for that. And I do think that it's one of the things that philanthropy can do best. So thank you. I'm happy to take questions if you have them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rip. And since we're doing the live stream, we want to make sure people at home or in different parts of the world can hear what we're discussing. So on your tables are index cards. I know we're not a quiet group in West Virginia, so if you have a question, scratch it out. Members of our team, Grace, Caitlin, will be collecting those and bringing those up. So as you think about a question, I see there's already one right here. I'll start with I guess the softball kickoff, Rip, of a question. So we talked about last night, but these are systemic issues, and keeping people's energy and focus and drive in place. How do you maintain that, especially with desperate needs in Detroit and certain parts of West Virginia with evolutions of economy? There's been decades of challenges. How did you maintain that hope and that opportunity?
It's the right question. I think actually, though, the answer is that is not philanthropy's role. I think that is the sort of the resilience of the people of the community. And again, I apologize for that being a cliche, but it would have been so much easier to turn the lights off in Detroit in 2008, or in Pittsburgh in the decline of the steel, or in Seattle when Boeing went bankrupt. My sense is that ultimately the folks of the community feel too strongly to not keep fighting. Now, having said that, you can only fight for so long. I mean, it's too hard, and you've got to develop a small win strategy. And so in all of the examples I gave you, one of the things we tried to calibrate was, are there very tangible things out of the box at the same time people are trying to look down the road, long-term, sort of building to a very different kind of trajectory? Are there very specific things people can point to as sources of confidence, almost sort of on-ramps to hope? And we just were shameless about saying, we've got to identify what those are. We've got to put some money behind it. That's one of the reasons the Whole Foods move was so important. Could we have used our $900,000 differently? Sure, of course. We could have built something out much longer term, and that's why we had this sort of Green Grocers Fund. We were thinking over time we need to sort of build the infrastructure and do the analysis and do all of that stuff. But when we had an opportunity that was right there, right then, it just seemed to us that was going to be worth 10 times anything that we could do with a long-term planning process. When people actually saw that a Whole Foods store open, you could just feel the change in the attitude. But I think at the end of the day, it is sort of falling back on the folks who believe most deeply in your community. Those leadership really matters. It can't be one person. It probably can't even be 2 or 3 people. But it can be 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 people, and those folks can create a kind of critical mass around opportunity and hope and optimism that is contagious. And I don't mean to deify him, but for those of you who ever have the chance to meet Roger Penske, that's what he was for our community. Penske has been like a rock in our community, and he has sort of freed up others to sort of join him in the effort, and it's been inspiring. But ultimately, it's because he believed deeply in the community.
Thanks, Rip. Here's one really good question. It kind of came up last night at dinner. So when the foundations contributed to Detroit's bankruptcy, how did many of the nonprofits survive when part of their funding was redirected?
Oh, that's an interesting question. For those of you who may not know, the Detroit bankruptcy ultimately hinged on something called the Grand Bargain. This was a fund that was assembled by philanthropy and by the state of Michigan and by the Detroit Institute of Arts to reduce the hit the pensioners would take in a bankruptcy, and to take the Detroit Institute of Arts art collection out of play from the creditors, because the creditors were going after the pieces in the DEIA under the assumption that it was a city-owned asset and they could grab them. So we put together a fund of almost $860 million to help buffer the pension hit and to bring the art out of public ownership. The assumption was that this should be above and beyond expenditures that we would otherwise make in the community. Kresge did exactly that. We put $100 million into that fund, and it was directly out of our corpus. We basically said there is no way that the money that we spend each year in Detroit should be reduced by the amount that we're putting into the grand bargain. That feeds exactly that kind of question. Then you're harming all of the networks of support in the community that you've worked so hard to build up. We tried to convince many of our colleagues to take that same attitude. Some have, some haven't. And the grand bargain will be paid into over 20 years, so I'm hoping that at the end of the day, it will not come at the cost of the other kinds of investments that the philanthropic community make in Detroit. But there is that risk, and I think particularly the arts organizations, I think particularly the symphony in Detroit and the opera in Detroit are afraid that having put all of this money into one arts cause will cause folks to be less generous into their efforts. And I think the best we can do is to say that ought not to be, that this was a one-time event. It was intended to get us out of the bankruptcy. We needed to stretch. It needed to hurt us a little bit, the same way it hurt pensioners and it hurt other folks in Detroit, and therefore we ought to stay true to our principles.
Well, you must be reading the cards.
Uh-oh.
Because the next question is, can you talk about the role of the arts in economic revitalization?
The sixth function that I didn't put up was to support some of the fragile ecologies of a place, whether that's access to fresh food, whether that's human services provision, or whether it's arts and culture. It is, I think, almost impossible to imagine the kind of renaissance we've seen in Detroit without tracing it back to the role of arts and cultural activity. When I came to Detroit in 2006, almost all of the arts support was directed to the major arts institutions. Nothing wrong with that. These are world-class institutions, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, the Michigan Opera Theater, and much of that support came from the corporate givers. What we decided to do right out of the box was to try to create more of an ecology of arts and cultural activity in Detroit that involved smaller arts organizations, startup arts organizations, support for individual artists. So we created an operating support program at Kresge that each year offers operating support to 62 arts organizations in the Detroit region. We also created an arts fellowship fund that each year funds 20 artists at $25,000 apiece so that an individual artist doesn't have to necessarily wait tables. We don't ask them to produce anything or to deliver anything up. It's simply a way of trying to support the ecology. And we've also underwritten a lot of the arts infrastructure in Detroit, back office support, festivals, a whole suite of other things. And I think what has happened in part as a result of Kresge's infusion, but also the Ford Foundation then came in on top of that, as did the Knight Foundation. We've created a sort of a sense of energy around arts and culture that has been just palpably important in driving the sort of not only the energy of neighborhoods, but the economic revitalization of different sections of town. I mean, arts, again, are frontline risk takers. Artists are willing to go where others aren't willing to go. And the transformation in neighborhoods all throughout Detroit through these really innovative, funky, and some traditional arts has been a remarkable shaper of the sort of the future of Detroit. You can't go to Detroit, I don't think, Monica, and not sort of see sort of arts on every street corner, and it's made a huge difference.
Another great question. What is the role of leaders who are low income and working class?
I'm hesitating a little bit because that in many ways defines sort of the leadership structure of Detroit. I mean, it's one thing for Roger Penske and Dan Gilbert to sort of take their piece of the world and Roger to drive a rail project or or Gilbert to drive a downtown revitalization. But at the end of the day, with 700,000 residents and 139 square miles, the leadership in the future of Detroit has to come from the neighborhoods. It just has to come from the neighborhoods. And one of the reasons we put so much stock in this land use planning process was to try to figure out how to give voice to folks in the community who are going to drive their destiny. Because what we found from New Orleans and what we found from other places is that where community development and economic development is done purely sort of top down, it doesn't stick. It just doesn't stick. There may be a project here or a suite of projects over there, but at the end of the day, attempts to revitalize and redirect neighborhoods have to be led by the people who have ownership in those places. And so we have spent a lot of time and energy as a community, not just as Kresge, trying to build the capacity of local folks to identify opportunities, manage their way through crisis, and ultimately sort of be in charge of the way their communities work. We could talk more about it, but we have an entire program that is sort of aimed at neighborhood-based leadership development, which we think is important. It's also, I might say, a huge emerging priority of the Ford Foundation. Ford is dramatically reorganizing under its new president, and one of the things the head of their economic development work believes is that they really need to infuse money into granular, local, neighborhood-based leadership. So you're going to, I think, see Ford emerging as a real leader in this field in Detroit and other places.
Leadership at all levels is what makes it happen. Final question that we received. There is a new $1.8 million economic diversification fund forming in West Virginia called Strong Mountain Communities. And they are asking hundreds of West Virginians for their input. What advice would you give them, to them, this new group, wanting to help create good paying, sustainable jobs? It's a long question, but I can repeat.
Well, I think it's a couple of different questions wrapped into one. I think the most difficult part to answer is, are there particular strategies I would advise? And I think that, at some kind of meta level, sure. Workforce training, better education, career pathways, and community college. I mean, there are a whole suite of issues that you know as well as I. I think the more interesting, or not more interesting, the more difficult question is how is that input meaningful? Because I think that's what's so hard for communities to get right, which is, what is that balance that I talked about with our Detroit land use planning? What's the balance between the kind of expertise, high-level professional input, and day-to-day folks who just live on the ground and want to direct their future in a different way? It's so easy to sort of make the mistake on both sides that any community voice is legitimate and should control, right? That's a recipe for disaster for all sorts of reasons. And similarly, any expert knows more than anyone in the community. That's a recipe for disaster. And so what we found was that the tension zone of when those two worlds meet is the really productive zone. So as in our process, we had these technical groups developing ideas about how to use water differently, how to take advantage of subsurface water or use water for different forms of green-blue infrastructure. Well, they would then come into a community meeting and go toe-to-toe with the neighborhood that said, well, what does that have to do with safety? What does that have to do with my bus route? And ultimately what ended up happening was this sort of modulation in the middle where that the things that were important to the community ended up being things that the technical advisory group felt that they needed to explore more deeply, develop background on more deeply. And similarly, the kinds of things that were coming out of the technical teams began influencing the nature of the conversations of the neighborhoods. The neighborhood folks all of a sudden hadn't really thought that you could do this, and this with something. And so it's difficult. It was just excruciating. It took us 4 years. But what ended up, I think, being really important was that meeting in the middle. And there, I think, you've just got to really bust up traditional civic engagement processes. We ran this like a political campaign. We had meetings in church basements. We had electronic platforms. We had interactive mapping exercises. We had one-on-ones. We had what we didn't do much of were the big convenings in gymnasiums where someone grabs a mic and for the next 45 minutes tells you how rotten sewer service is. And so what I think, I guess the advice would be try to figure out this balance between community voice and expertise, and then really go to school on sort of the next generation ways of getting people involved in decision making, because I think it's not the old sort of Saul Alinsky techniques, and it's not the old stand up and present techniques that I think our public officials often find most expedient. It's much more nuanced, it's much more complicated, and I think it feeds much more into a next generation way of thinking. Someone told me, and then I'll stop, Paul, someone told me the story the other day that they had been stopped at a forum by someone from Detroit who just complained about our community engagement process and said, and he was someone in his early 70s, had been a long-time civil rights advocate, and he said, you know, this, it was a travesty. They didn't listen to me, they didn't hear me out. And then a young woman came, who was listening to this exchange, came over, who was also from Detroit, and she was about 22, and she said, you know, I actually think you're wrong. I think what happened is that they didn't listen to you in a way that you have become accustomed to being listened to. They did listen to me. And she went on this sort of long discussion about how she had sort of texted and gotten her friends in some kind of crowdsourcing thing to figure out what to do with a vacant lot. And I mean, it was just this sort of clash of generations. And I think one of the challenges we have is recognizing that we are in new and different times. I keep looking at new and different times down there. And that there are different ways of engaging people and making information accessible and putting information into use and finding ways to leverage big data. I mean, all this stuff, it's a new world. And if we insist on organizing ourselves the same way, I think we're going to run into a bunch of roadblocks that won't be very productive.
Thank you, Rip. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you help me with that right there?
So, West Virginia, we pride ourselves on hospitality. And more importantly, at Philanthropy West Virginia, one of our policies is buy 100% local as much as possible.
Fantastic.
So this will be sent to your office. You're welcome to open it. You don't have to carry it on the plane. But thanks to the Tamarack Foundation, it's one of West Virginia artisans' pieces that's made by a local artisan. We can't thank you enough for joining us for the past 24 hours after a very long week of travel across the country. So our thanks to you, and we'll get you to the airport here in a little bit.
Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. So you heard a lot of ideas and opportunities from launching solutions. So we talked about Dan Gilbert. I want you to change that a little bit. Don't just think of the numbers of millions or billions. Think thousands and hundreds of thousands of millions. You think about Dan Gilbert, but we have Ken Allman in Hinton doing great things. We have Millie Marshall at Toyota. We have Henry Harmon here in Charleston. When you think of the Riverfront Walk in Detroit, we have the Clay Center here in Charleston, which I have to say Rip was enthralled with yesterday, saying the facilities in Detroit they pale in comparison to what we have here. We have the Harless Center in Gilbert. We have many programs and projects that we should be proud of and look at how we're doing innovative efforts in many ways. It doesn't have to be $1 million or $10,000. It could be $1,000. And I just have to say, as a lot of people say in West Virginia, entrepreneurship's not present. I have seen so many amazing things done on local levels with entrepreneurial spirit, converting those dollars into amazing things. Well, today, again, would not be possible without the Mayor Foundation. Our good friends of the Greater Kanawha Valley Foundation, the staff there, including Jane Young, our staff at Philanthropy West Virginia, Caitlin Noe, and Grace McDaniel. But as we leave here today, we want you to move forward with some options, some actions, and how we're going to do that. Most importantly, take a second, look at who's sitting to your left. I'm asking you to really do that, yes. Look to your right. These are your partners. For us to take us into the golden age of this great state, to prove to people that we're not just an excellent national power, but a worldly power, We are the answer. We're going to do this together, but hopefully learning from folks like Kresge and bringing partnerships to the table. This fall at Philanthropy West Virginia's annual conference, in partnership with our group, the West Virginia Nonprofit Association, we'll be convening a joint summit on October 7th, doing an opportunity to bring the foundation community together with nonprofits as far as basic learning, but also how do we collaborate, work together on a number of issues. Laura Lee Haddad, a member of our team, is in the back of the room, and Laura Lee, please raise your hand up. We'll be hosting that event as we'll go through and continue dialogues and learning experiences of many things. But most importantly, we'll do this together. And so take some time to celebrate some pride for West Virginia, but also learn from this conversation as we look forward to hopefully having Rip back, and I've got zip lining planted in his brain. But again, going back to that quotation from Henry Ford, it's a start, it's a beginning, but staying together is success and progress. Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.